would like to introduce my friend and brother first, Abdalla Ernest, whole name Abdalla Ernest Baba Joseph. And the best thing for introducing him is his trip to Fikr al-Jamhuriyah. He became a Muslim, and then at some point in America, he asked some people to advise him. They gave him two advices. One is to go to Saudi Arabia, and he met a Sudanese, and he said to him, no, go to Ustadh Mahmoud Mohammed Taha, which he did. And of course, if he took the first option, he won't be talking to you right now here. With that, I just would like to introduce my best friend, Abdallah, to his topic. Thank you so much.
Shukran yaki. Sabru akbaru min sabri. It made me think of Ustadh Mahmoud when I came to know him, observing him over the 9 years I was in Sudan. He was with us for over eight of those 9 years I was in Sudan. So I started off saying from a Qasida, Sabru akbaru min sabri. When I think of sabr, I remember when we were in Bayt al-Akhwan, Alif, Ba, Jim, Dal, Ustadh used to sometimes give us exercises. One of the exercises that he gave us, going back to our homes after a long day's work, was he asked us the question, what is greater than sabr, than patience? We went back to our 4 houses and we discussed this issue for, I don't know, several days. And people had many different answers. Ustadh informed us that what is beyond patience is contentment with Allah. Contentment with Allah. And when I used to stand in the zikr and watch Ustadh Mahmoud pretty much every evening that I was in Sudan, where Ustadh was outside of prison, we would have a zikr circle, and for about 45 minutes before the sunset. And I would stand very close to Ustadh Mahmoud in that circle. And one of the things that I remember about that was to look at him and to think, this is the personification of contentment. This man is content with Allah. And I had another thing that came to my mind when looking at him. I'll share with you. I used to say, he's super cool. That was kind of the words that came to me in English, super cool. And this had to do with the way he carried himself, humble, but with extreme dignity. He moved gracefully. He was always immaculate, dressed in white. The way he interacted with people, his compassion, his presence when he dealt with you. He gave you his full presence when he dealt with you. And I just said, in looking at him, standing next to him, that he's super cool. So I took away from my initial meetings with Ustadh Mahmoud a lot from his personality, how he carried himself. And then I gradually started to get into his thought. But I will just honestly tell you that I've never met a human being close to him before, not close. He handed me a couple of books when I first arrived, and they were pamphlets, and I read them, and I came back. And in his very present way, he asked me what I thought. And I told him immediately, I said, I think you're the truth that I came here looking for. And the first thing he said to me was, oh, but you can't know that for certain. Listen at that, man. You can't be certain of that. He said, the only way that you could become certain is to investigate and find whether we actually walk our talk. Live with us and see if we, in fact, are practicing what we're preaching. And I let him know my bags were at the door. I already was impressed enough to dedicate some time. I didn't initially think I would stay 8 years, but things happen. And I didn't have any better place to be, actually. So those were 8 and plus 1 after his execution of the best days of my life. Really feeling as if, as a person who was born a Christian and who was actually searching for insight into deen. I didn't use those words as a Christian, but I said I'm searching for answers. My grandmother was a preacher. And she told me, she said, focus on Jesus. She gave me a Bible with just the red print in it, the words and teachings of Jesus in red. Everything else is in black ink. And I just focused on that, trying to understand who was Jesus Christ, peace be upon him. And in that process, I started asking questions, and I didn't get enough answers to the questions that I asked. And so I continued to do the things that I did, and part of what I did was I've always been politically and socially active, at least since I left high school. And so one of the things that I found in my political activism, such that it was that many of the people who were professing very laudable ideologies, black liberation, socialism, Marxism, Maoism, cultural nationalists, black Muslims, many of the folks that I was observing and listening to, and in some case studying, I found there was a gap between their individual practice and what they were preaching. And that troubled me. And so for a while, because I didn't have the answers from Christianity that I was looking for, before I met Ustadh Mahmoud, I stepped back and started to focus on the politics. But I kept coming back to my own reality, which was I was not practicing what I was preaching. And so I realized that there had to be some type of methodology that God should make present to his creation. This was my thinking. It struck me that if we are to believe in a all-powerful, all-wise, all-compassionate Creator God, then at some point our Creator would need to make his revelation clear. And I didn't understand until I met Ustadh Mahmoud that creation is developmental. Prophets are instructed to speak to people according to their ability, their level of understanding. I met with Ustadh one time and asked him to explain to me this notion of a monotheistic trinity. Because, again, I came out of Christianity, and even though I explored many other religions, I never severed myself from Christianity, not from Christ. So I was interested, and here is a Muslim who has a pamphlet about the return of Christ, and who speaks about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam being a trinity. So I asked some brothers, and we had a conversation. I still wasn't clear. So I went to Ustadh Mahmoud, and in about 2 minutes, he explained it to me. He drew a triangle. He showed me that the base of the triangle was La ilaha illallah at different iterations, whether it be to Ibrahim or Noah or Moses or Jesus or Muhammad, peace be upon them all. Different codes, different messages. And then up the side of the triangle, you're moving towards infinity, towards Allah. And then he drew a line through the triangle and said, these are the prophets. Each of them came at a different time and in a different place with La ilaha illallah. Sayyidina Muhammad has brought it. He says after Christ, but we have to ask ourselves the question, and this is a question I had never asked myself, but I was so happy that he brought it up. And that was, why after the lofty teachings of Jesus Christ would we need another prophet? Why after a prophet comes to earth teaching, love thy neighbor as thyself, love thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind, love those who despitefully use you, and all these teachings of Christ, right? Why after Jesus Christ was there a prophet? And Ustadh informed me that the reason for that was a methodology to be present for human beings to be able to develop the qualities that allow them to turn the cheek after they are struck on one cheek, to love those who despitefully use you. And so he explained to me in that moment what is really part of the core message of Fikr Jamhuriya. And you know the history of it, how it evolves over time from a political movement until a deep, insightful understanding of the Quran, which realizes that the Quran is two clear messages. And this is an important point that I'd like to speak to. I'm losing my train. But the Quran, in its first message, also comes after Christ. But it has to establish itself in the community in which it's revealed. And so in the first message, based mainly on the verses revealed from Medina, we see a different standard. You know that standard. It's been pointed out. First, in Mecca, Muslims are told that there's no compulsion in religion. Just teach them the truth and leave the rest to God. And then in Medina, they are told, take the sword, spread the religion of God, right? Fight until the way of God is open. And so these are two levels. You could consider them to be contradictions, or you can understand that they're two distinct levels. The first level was what people were capable of in the 7th century. Not only were problems solved there using violence and war, that was the typical way that people solved problems in Arabia and throughout the world, but also in terms of the revelations to women that a man could marry 4 wives, There's some scholarship that says, well, that was because there was an excess of men. That's true because they were killing each other off. But there was another reason, and that was that Islam was taking root in this transitional stage. And so it said, marry 1, 2, 3, up to 4, but treat them equally. And of course, at the time, based upon the capacity of the people at the time, equality meant giving the same material things and spending the same amount of time with each woman. But the Quran also comes back and says in another verse, you cannot treat them fairly. And you take the two verses together, as Ustadh does in his argument, and it clearly shows that the original teaching was to teach them fairly, but the people were not ready for that teaching, and so they were given a transitional stage, which was marry up to 4 and treat them as well as you can. And this point, I think, manifests itself in different places in Islam, but in the basics of what we consider to be Islam. If we think about zakat, we know that a person is to give a portion of their wealth. We also know that Sayyidina Muhammad did not take from zakat, nor did he pay into it. We also know that his standard of living was different than the standard of living that he imposed upon the Muslims of the first century. This gets to this methodology we're talking about. The Prophet's standard of living was one that we really could say is much closer to socialism than it was to capitalism. Examples of that are many. One of the clearest examples is where the Holy Prophet was about to start to pray. He raised his hands. The other Muslims behind him raised their hands, and then he walked away from the prayer and went home. He came back sometime later and continued the prayer. After the prayer, some of his companions asked him, what happened? We've never seen you do that before. And he explained to them what? That he had left a small amount of money, a dinar, at home. He had it stored. And he didn't want to face his God storing any money. Why? Because his code was to depend completely on Allah. There's other examples when people would come to visit him. This is the difference between the Holy Prophet and Rasul. The Holy Prophet and his relationship to God, Rasul and his relationship to the people of the 7th century. The Holy Prophet did not store food in his home. Guests came to his house. He asked Aisha to go and get some food for the guests, and you know the story. She came back, said there's nothing there. He sends her back and sends her back, and she finally comes back with a nabak. That's all he has in his home. And he says, cut that up and share it with our guests. Because he didn't store food, he didn't store wealth, he depended completely on God. That standard is the standard that Ustadh Mahmoud is saying represents Islam in its highest iteration. Because you know we have Islam, and then we have Iman, and then we have Ihsan. And Ustadh is saying Islam in its first stage is elementary. It's, I say, La ilaha illallah, Muhammad Rasulullah, and I become a Muslim. That's with my tongue. But there's a level of Islam that Ustadh talks about, which is above Ihsan. It's above certainty. He talks about 3 levels of certainty and then a 7th level, which is Islam. And that's the Islam that Allah had to be talking about when he said, on this day I perfected my religion unto you and perfected my grace unto you, and I call it religion Islam. He wasn't talking about Islam with the tongue. So this notion that of Ustadh identifying this purpose for the Prophet and the special quality of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, which was that he lived according to a different code. And what Ustadh Mahmoud is saying is those verses that governed his life, primarily revealed in Mecca, can serve as the basis of Islamic law. This is why if you say, oh, I haven't heard of this and I haven't heard of that, and well, no, you haven't. Because what we've heard for the last 1,400 years is interpretations based upon the first message of Islam. You have the first message codified in the Quran, and then you have interpretations of that message by various different scholars over the last 1,400 years. And they're not mentioning democracy. They're not mentioning the other term that I forgot that came up, but they're not mentioning terms that Ustadh Mahmoud is talking about today, Jamhuriyeen or terms like that. No. What's being articulated is if we look carefully, we see two levels existing at the time of the Holy Prophet Muhammad, clear in his prayer. He didn't pray 5 times a day. He prayed the night prayer as obligatory upon himself and didn't allow other Muslims to pray it when they tried. He fasted different. Siyam Samadi. Things that he did were distinctly different. And if we think of Ustadh Mahmoud's clarity when he says that that had to do with his relationship to God, that is the essential, original code of Islam, and then understand that what followed when people during that time were not able to live up to that code was the transitional code of Islam. Well, that sounds preposterous at one level, right? How are we now going to change from one code of Islam to another? Well, we did it in the beginning. We abrogated Mecca in order to implement Medina. Why not abrogate Medina to implement the original verses of the Quran? That's all Ustadh Mahmoud is saying. And there's a logic behind it. Ustadh says this. If that isn't the case, we'd have to believe that the highest principles of Islam were revealed only for 13 years. Then they were abrogated, right, for the rest of time. Think about that. God in his wisdom created a religion where the highest principles of the religion were only revealed for 13 years. And then after that, we get transitional, subsidiary codes which were to follow for the rest of time. What would that say? I think that has led some current Islamic scholars to talk about the best days of Islam being in the past, in those first 13 years, or sometime, or during the life of the Holy Prophet Muhammad. But think about that for a second. If the best days of Islam are in the past, then what do we have to live for other than heaven? Why worry about the revolution in Sudan? Why worry about how the Muslim brothers are doing what they have always done, right? Looking out for themselves, misrepresenting themselves as both Muslims and brothers. We should expect it. So, I mean, my thinking over time has come to the point where I believe in Ustadh Mahmoud's teachings. And one of the reasons I believe in it is because they're not merely addressing Muslims. They do that. They resolve what is the primary dilemma of Islam today, which is how is it going to be applied in the 21st century? That is a dilemma. Because if anybody thinks it's going to be applied by jihad in this world right now, they're living in a make-believe pastime. That is not going to happen. So, not only is it addressing the issues of the primary dilemma in Islam right now, but it's doing it in a way that is comprehensive and, as the brothers were saying earlier, based upon the Quran and Hadith. And this is very important because we have scholars throughout the Muslim world. We have some people with some very good ideas. But Ustadh Mahmoud just doesn't have a very good idea. He is saying The Quran was revealed to Sayyidina Muhammad with two messages. And he talks about everything is mathani. And that there's verses to support that. Kulu shayin khalaqna zawjayn la'alakum nazakarun. Allahu nanzala asra hadith kitaban mutashabihan. Asan hadith kitaban mutashabihan. Mathani. Is that it? So this notion that there are, in fact, two messages should be something that people really should take a moment to investigate and entertain. That's in the context of Islam. But I even step back. In the context of monotheism, Islam comes after Judaism and Christianity. Just as Christianity informs Judaism, even though many Jews do not accept it to do so, it clearly does, and Christ clearly said that he did not come to destroy Judaism, but to fulfill it. Islam comes after Christianity. So just as Christianity informs and gives perspective on Judaism, Islam informs and gives perspective on Christianity. However, we have to be careful not to fall victim to some of the current scholarship, saying that Jews are not Jews and Christians are not Christians, arguing that the basic tenet of Christianity is not true, that Christ never died on the cross. There's better interpretations of those verses than the ones that are being perpetuated throughout the Islamic world right now. We are told to believe in the books and to not harm people of the books, right? For a reason, because that is monotheism. That is a rudimentary stage of La ilaha illallah. That is a rudimentary stage of Islam, just like Sayyidina Ibrahim was the first Muslim. Well, he wasn't a Muslim following Sayyidina Muhammad. What kind of Muslim was he? He was a Muslim because he was completely submitted to the will of God. We know the stories. They threw him into fire. The angel Gabriel comes to him and says, "Take my hand." What does he say? "Who are you?" He says, "Gabriel." Who sent you? "Allah." He said, "If Allah knows I'm here, why would I need to take your hand?" This is a Muslim, a person whose will is completely submitted to Allah. That's a different level of Islam, and that's the level of Islam that Ustadh Mahmoud's talking about. And then he goes further, as the brothers were talking about, and he elaborates an entire structure to create a good society, a healthy community. So as you have a methodology that can allow people to become more harmonized and more enlightened and mentally and spiritually healthier, he also focuses on what's very important, which is to make sure that the community supports that growth. And that was the three equalities that were talked about earlier: economic equality, socialism, but not Marxism; political equality, democracy, but not this mess in this country, with the two parties, and people who profess freedom but cannot define it. Ustadh Mahmoud defines freedom, just like he defines everything else. But he says, when it was said earlier, it's to think what you want, say what you think, do what you say, with revision what you say and think doesn't harm other people. But he also says it's to take responsibility for your actions and the consequences of your actions. A free person takes responsibility for their actions and the consequences of their actions. So what we're seeing now is a long way from that. Ustadh Mahmoud also has a discourse on Western democracy, where he talks about how it's compromised by capitalism. And we end up with the best democracy that money can buy. We end up with a system where people with money can influence the outcomes. And if you don't have enough money, you cannot even run for office. And if you have enough money, you can enter the race late and flood this country with ads and overtake many of the other candidates who are more popular than you with the general population. That's happening right now. That's not democracy. That's the contamination of democracy with capitalism. Democracy really is about exercising freedom in a responsible way to self-govern yourself as you're not harming others. That's what it is. That's not what we see. So Ustadh Mahmoud's ideas, I think, are useful specifically for Muslims. They also, for monotheists, they're quite useful. And I also think for the world, they're quite useful. Because when he talks about the prayer of the Holy Prophet Muhammad being a psychotherapeutic practice that can alleviate disorders, that can clear your mind and calm your heart and allow you to interact with people more peacefully and turn the other cheek when you're harmed. When he talks about that, that's a methodology that can be utilized outside of the monotheistic tradition. That's a methodology that can be utilized worldwide. And when Ustadh Mahmoud talks about developing social equality in our communities and says that the indication of it is when people can marry from any other group, where we don't have these prejudices based upon race and creed and color and religion dividing us. And he starts very early with the conceptualization of the time in which we live, which is the time where the second message of Islam can appeal to people's minds. It is not a doctrine that they have to follow. It would be in the context of a society that's governed by a constitution. The Muslims would be setting an example for people to follow, but people could practice or not practice what they want, as long as they do not break the laws of the society. There's always going to be law and order, but that's the minimal level. We should be hoping to live far above that. And our example of that was the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. His morality, Sayyidina Aisha said, was the Quran. His morality was the Quran. That's our example. Now, it's not saying that we're trying to be prophets. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that Sayyidina Muhammad was sent here for a reason. And he fulfilled that reason. And his true fulfillment of it was the revelation of the Quran. And we have to ask ourselves honestly, do we really think that Sharia Islamiyah is the code that can govern the 21st century? We have to ask ourselves that. If it can, then how are we going to solve that dilemma? We cannot rely on intelligent scholars from around the world to come up with their own ideologies. That will lead to chaos. What better idea has been put forward so far than to return to the Quran and to investigate the Quran and to see the two distinct levels of revelation in the Quran and understand that the Holy Prophet Muhammad lived according to the code of the original message of the Quran, which only was practiced for 13 years. What better idea? This is specific, I would say, to Muslims, has been put forward so far. I think that idea requires scholarship, but like Ustadh Mahmoud says, it requires more than scholarship. Ustadh talks about a couple of things. One is he wants people to be really clear on and understanding that there's a difference between Islam and the interpretation of scholars. Those are two distinctly different things. We have to really get clear on that point, right? And there's, of course, a difference between professing to understand something at a theoretical level and practicing it, right? Practicing it and understanding it at a visceral level. So in other words, Ustadh suggests that to truly understand our religion, we have to practice it. It's through practicing worship that we actually gain insight into ourselves and into the true meaning of La ilaha illallah. Because that is really about ma'amala. And ma'amala, as Ustadh points out, is a part of your worship. So Ustadh said that the prayer is not from Salamu Alaikum from Bismillah to Salamu Alaikum. It's from Salamu Alaikum to Bismillah. What he's saying there is pretty obvious, but I'll just articulate it anyway. But I think what he's saying there is that the only way that we truly know that you are praying is to observe how you treat people between your prayers. Other than that, the prayer has very little value. So certainly for the community, right? Maybe it has some value for that, for you other than that, but how do you know that your prayer itself is being perfected? That could only be known in terms of you're practicing your ma'amala between your prayers. And the feedback you get from that will let you know whether or not you are doing it properly or not. That concept of prayer is critically important, not just for Muslims, but all across the board. Not just for monotheists, but all across the board. Because there's a lot of people just in the Trinity, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, that believe going in and out of the synagogue, church, or mosque, doing rituals so many times a day is worship. No, that's ritual. Worship should, as Ustadh says, have an impact on your morality. If it's not impacting our morality, then what value is it? What is the true value? God doesn't need our worship. God created us to worship him, but not because he needs it. It's beyond need. So who's the worship for? The worship is for us. To do what? Get into heaven? We could have been placed directly in heaven. We're down here. We fell. Satan and Adam fell to here, to earth, right? So we've got to tie our worship to being here now. What is the real purpose of that? And I think Ustadh Mahmoud's ideas are glorious for humanity because, as he's saying, there's good news. You know, there's good news. There is a second message of Islam. There is clarity of monotheism, right? And the good news is that if people embrace it and practice it, they will perfect their morality. Not become perfect, but perfect their morality, which is a infinite process because you're actually trying to approximate the qualities of God, which are infinite. And they will begin to solve their problems. And through implementation, they will learn how to live more justly and compassionately with one another. And all of this is leading towards that peace on earth that we so badly need. Peace on earth used to be a saying that people thought was kind of cute. But right now, we can see that if we don't figure out a way to live together on this earth, there's high probability that some of these people in power now and who will likely be in power in the future could lead us down a deadly path. That's a gloomy place to end, but I would like to be real. I think that that's a real consideration. And I don't know how the time is. Is this a good time for questions? Okay, we'll stop there for questions. Thank you.
Open for discussions.
Thank you.
Please, when you ask your question, let us know about you too. So introduce yourself and ask a question, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing your experience with us in regard to the Al-Fikr al-Jamhuriya and how you came to know it and embrace it, and a very good presentation. I can see where you came from and how you ended up. If that's an end, I hope it's not, and that's my question.
Okay.
Is, as a seeker, you described yourself at the very beginning that you were seeking answers in many ways. Part of it was social, political, and you come from the background of a Christian as well. So the social questioning is always a struggle because it's everyday change, it's everyday work in a way, with people, with organizations, with groups and communities. The other way of searching or seeking is the spiritual side, which brought you somehow to the Fikr al-Jamhuriya. So how do you reconcile the two? Why do you think you should stop here as a seeker?
Okay.
Is it a revelation? Is it or because you speak about ideas, you speak about convincing, you speak about seeing the logic of it, and that's where you will somehow depart from for me at least, from the spiritual side.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah.
Yeah, so
I didn't catch your name.
reconciliation.
Hamid? Hafiz. Thank you.
The reconciliation for me between the spiritual and, say, social activism came by way of spending time with Al-Ustadh and the Jamhuriyin and starting to self-reflect, right? And the primary thing that attracted me to Islam in the first place, before I even came to Sudan, was that it's comprehensive. So it's a code for the individual and for the society. And for me, that made sense. It should be that way. You shouldn't just have a code for the individual, and then individuals go into society and behave any way they want to behave. Ustadh Mahmoud says this, right? So I was attracted to Islam because it had a code of behavior for the individual, and a code of behavior for the community or the society. I felt that I could stop seeking when I discovered Tariq Muhammad. That's what's so beautiful about Fikr al-Jamhuriya, is that, I'll tell you a story. There were some Americans that were at university with me, University of Khartoum, both of them Muslims, Khadija and Jamila, and they were very worried about me. And they said, I can't believe, brother, that you came all the way over to Sudan to get into a cult. We're really worried about you. We understand there's only a couple hundred people following this teacher, and what are you thinking? Okay, that was breakfast one day at the Nadia Sadza. So I thought about their question, and I could see on the surface why they were asking the question. And then something came to me. The thing that really is unusual about Ustadh Mahmoud is he never said, follow me. Ustadh Mahmoud never said, do as I do. Ustadh Mahmoud never asked us for anything materially. Never. In 9 years. Nothing. I mean, in my house we paid rent because you got to have somewhere to stay. But that's it. He didn't take from us at all. And so because of that, I had to say, well, what is he directing us towards? And what he's directing us towards is an enlightened understanding of Tariq Muhammad. And I already was convinced, you know, as I said earlier, Islam came after Christianity. Islam can inform both Christianity and Judaism just by its proximity. And then when I learned about how amazing the life and practice and teachings of the Holy Prophet were, I didn't know where else to go after that. That was kind of what I was looking for. I was looking, remember in the beginning, my thing was, God must have clarified this somewhere. That was my thought before I met Ustadh. And when he said, Tariq Muhammad, and then it's Sunnah, and then this is how we distinguish what people are calling Sunnah from actual Sunnah. He said, the people are saying it's everything that the Prophet did and said. No, some of the things he did as Rasulullah to the people. He taught them things, he did things in his role as the messenger to the people of that time. And then there's his personal behavior. That's the Sunnah that Ustadh was illuminating, and in that is his worship, and in that is his mu'amala, and in that is many of his teachings. And I just have not found anything more comprehensive and more clear. And as I have practiced it, though imperfectly, I have felt the power of it.
Assalamu alaikum. Brother, I think I'll just go on the same way, maybe have to say a little bit about this one. Okay. This is not personal, but just if it was not the case that you were lucky or, you know, person just indicated that, you know, you go there and you meet Ustadh Mahmoud Mohammed Taha. Would that be a different, you know, like, if that's something that was made for you, this is what it was, you know, this is the right path, and then, you know, God or whatever power was leading you to that point, and then you arrived at this one? Or in another way, what are other things that you measured, you know, just continuing being a Muslim in the first place and being a follower or a tilmiz for Ustadh Mahmoud Mohammed Taha, for that matter, because you know, there are so many people who are not Muslims in the first place. There are people who are Muslims and who would never meet Ustadh Mahmoud Mohammed Taha.
Right.
And there are so many other ways of doing good things. So just, you know, from your thoughts and from your understanding, how do you see this?
Yeah.
Thank you.
There's two, I could hardly contain myself with that. I love that question.
My name is Kamal.
Kamal,
Thank
Kamal, shukran jazil. I hope I can answer that question, Kamal. Yeah, I hope I can answer that question. That's a great question. Two parts to it, right? I hope I can remember the second part. What was the second part?
Before.
Okay, maybe it'll come to me. Yeah, so, right, that's a good question. But here's a story, I tell this story, some of you have heard it. When I first got to Beit al-Ustadh, to Jamboree, this is August of '77, I got a job teaching at Aliyah High Secondary School. And one day, a student approached me after class. He wasn't my student. I was teaching different grade. He approached me and he said, "Are you following Mahmoud, whatever he said. And I said, yeah, Mahmoud Mohammed Taha. He said, yeah. He said, well, he's not a good Muslim. I said, well, who says so? Oh, he said, everybody knows that. I said, well, I have a different opinion than everybody. How do you know he doesn't? He said, oh, my uncle is really, knowledgeable of Islam. He says that Mahmoud Mohammed Taha doesn't practice true Islam. I said, oh. So I said, well, maybe I should talk to your uncle. And so he said, okay, I'll arrange something. So he came back to me a little later, and he said, my uncle is willing to meet with you. I said, well, what's his name? He said, oh, Hassan al-Turabi. I said, oh, okay. The name meant nothing to me, right? I was new to Sudan. I had only maybe been in Sudan maybe 4 months at that time. I didn't know who he was. So he said, Hassan Turabi. Okay, I said, okay. So I came home to the brothers, and I said, yeah, this one of my students invited me over to his house to meet his uncle. I said, who's his mom? He said, Hassan Turabi. Hassan Turabi? I said, yeah. You going to his house? I said, yeah. So you better go talk to Ustadh. So I said, okay. So I went to Ustadh Mahmoud, and I told him. He said, oh? He said, that should be a very interesting meeting. He said, Dr. Turabi is a very learned man. And I think you'll find that meeting very interesting. Come back and talk to me after you've met with him. That's Ustadh. Look at it. Wait, it gets better. So I go to, after school, this student, I can't remember his name, I wish I did, took me to his uncle's house. And what's that area straight down from Atlanta? Manchia. And they live 3-story house, very big. And I'm the first when I see the house, I'm going to Ustadh's little mud house, and then big stuff. Okay, I'm cool, I'm good. Yeah, I'm saying, okay. We go inside, and it looks like servants to me, right? The people in there are carrying things around and so forth, and they look like servants. Not, they're all males, and so I'm looking at them, and then Dr. Turabi said, oh, these are my relatives. And I said, okay, they're relatives. Then we had lunch. For the whole lunch, the student didn't stay. He said hi to his uncle, he left me just with his uncle. We had lunch together, just the two of us, Dr. Turabi and myself. Huh? Oh my God. It was the best lunch I had up to that point in Sudan. Portugal, everything at the end. You know that lunch. You know that really good lunch, it was that one. So the whole lunch, Dr. Turabi is telling me that Ustadh Mahmoud is violating Islam, he's not following the Quran, he's not following the teachings of the Holy Prophet Muhammad, the whole lunch. And I'm just enjoying my lunch. I'm trying to, right? And then, I think we're having tea, or dessert. I think it was tea, at the end. And I said, Dr. Turabi, I said, you've mentioned how Ustadh Mahmoud is violating the Quran, teachings of the Holy Prophet Muhammad. Can you give me an example of? And he stopped, he thought for a second, and then he said, and I quote, paradoxically enough, the only example that I can think of, I happen to agree with. And I was waiting, for another example, right? I want to think of another one, because you've been talking to me for like 40 minutes, and you've told me that this man's not a Muslim, he's violating the Quran, he's not, okay, nothing. So, I finished the tea, I say goodbye, I went back and it was time for zikr. And just before zikr, I went into his staff and he was alone in his room. Oh, done. He said, how was your meeting with Dr. Turabi? I said, oh, it's staff. And I told him, right, everything. He said, and what did you think? And I said, I think he's a hypocrite. That's what I said. And Ustadh said, no, Abdullah, we don't have to conclude that he's a hypocrite. He said, Dr. Turabi, like many Sudanese intellectuals, has a contradiction between his education and his understanding of Islam. So what you what you likely heard was that contradiction. I left there, I went to the zikr, and the only thing I could think of when I was in the zikr is that's the Muslim. That, not the guy who is saying all these horrible things about someone and can't give an example. It's the man who I tell you, this man was really trying to convince me that you are misleading people and you're not following Islam. And when I ask him for example, he can't come up with an example, not one. So that's a contrasting story, right? And that story speaks to the character of Ustadh Mahmoud. And that character, I could give you maybe 5 other stories that are equally as impactful, where you would expect one reaction from a normal human being, right? Something. And Ustadh not only doesn't give you that reaction, he defends the person. He tells you to treat the person better. And that level of deen, I haven't experienced it before. But that he was consistently that way for 9 years. Elamin Dawood, can I give that example? I got time? Yes. Okay. Elamin Dawood. Who knows who he was? A few people. Who was he? Somebody can tell, because I don't even really know his title. But what was he? What was Elamin Dawood? What was he? He's a scholar. He was a scholar, Islamic scholar, and he was very anti-Ustadh Mahmoud, right? Trying to actually try him as an apostate. He was part of that movement. Okay. When he died, I went into, God rest his soul, I went into the saloon, and there were brothers in there talking about Elamin Dawood had died. And so I asked them who he was, and they were telling me, and they told me some of the things, not the worst things, but some of the things that he had been saying about us. And they're horrible. I mean, I can't repeat them, they're so bad. Those weren't even the worst things, okay? So the brothers are kind of happy. You know, they're like, he's gone. And then Ustadh Mahmoud comes into the room, and he knows exactly what's going on. And immediately he says, I know that you've heard that Ahuna, Elamin Dawood, has passed away, and I don't want you to have anything in your heart against this man. He's going to suffer enough in the next life. And all you should have is compassion. And then he said, read Surah to the class with the class. What does that mean? Huh? Say it. Say what I just said. What did I just say? Yeah, ikhlas with the class. Bi-ikhlas. That's what he said to Elamin Dawood when Elamin Dawood passed away. So I was like,
So my name is Amran. So thank you so much, Ustadh Abdullah, for that lovely presentation. I liked so much the spiritual side of it, and especially your meeting with the Ustadh. And I believe that's huge energy and, that you felt. So that's maybe, in my opinion, that it drove you to Fikr al-Jumhuri. And I would say that to know things experientially is more important than intellectually, because that's what affects actually. Also, I like that you described that triangle with La ilaha illallah and prophets. So my question is, to keep it just brief, how would you put, for example, Baha'ism as a religion and Baha'u'llah as a prophet that came after like Islam in that triangle from the Al-Fikr al-Jumhuri point of view? Thank you.
Just have it will be the last question. You can answer it both. Thank you for the presentation that you made, and we got a lot of knowledge about your understanding of Islam and al-Fikr al-Jamhuriyya. Earlier, you talked about that we have a dilemma in the Islamic world because we cannot translate Islam in a good way. But in fact, the whole world now is in dilemma. And yesterday I was listening to Colonel West. He said that we are living in a market-driven society, impacted by new liberal capitalism, since we don't have reforms in the area of religion and politics. Do you think that, given that you are coming from the Christian background, do you think that there is some comparison between Ustadh Mahmoud and Martin Luther King, since as long as he reformed Christianity in a modern teaching or approach? And Ustadh Mahmoud also could be a reformer of Islam in a new way. Is there any connection between them, and how Ustadh Mahmoud is going to impact the future of Islam, since we have so many interpretations of Islam? We have Wahhabiyya, we have Akhwan Muslimin, and also we have Shia, and we have so many sectarian approaches of translating Islam. And I think that's why we are in dilemma. And also you said that earlier, it is very hard to make connection between Islam and those who translate Islam. And then there is another dilemma, because how we could know the real interpretation of Islam, since we have so many ways to understand Islam and to make it able to uplift the life of all Muslims.
Okay, I'm going to start with the Baha'u'llah question. I hope I can come to that one. Whoa, yeah. Baha'u'llah. I will first say, I love the Baha'i. I really do. Just the way they are, the way they interact with each other. I actually visited Baha'i temples when I was in Hawaii before I became a Muslim. And I have students who are Baha'i. I've had several students who are Baha'i. And one now invited me to a service maybe 3 weeks ago on a Friday. She does it at her home. I didn't go, but I would have if I was free. So I think in terms of their worship, in terms of their ma'amala with one another and with other people who are not Baha'i, they set a divine example. They're wonderful, wonderful. My thinking, and I believe this is consistent with Fikr al-Jamhuriyya, is that, and I didn't hear this from Ustadh, I heard it actually in a conversation with one of the brothers, so maybe I'll be corrected. But the notion is that Baha'u'llah comes after Sayyidina Muhammad. And the Quran is complete. When Allah said, if he said this, right? This is what on this day, somebody can repeat it better than me. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay? That perfection, that by Allah, of that religion, which is his religion. That's it. I mean, if that's true, if the Quran is true, right? Then the Creator sent the Holy Prophet Muhammad with the solution. It just is not Sharia Islamiyah. And so I think to have a prophet after Sayyidina Muhammad is problematic from an Islamic standpoint. It's not, I understand why many of the Sufiya, for instance, and he came from, I think, Al-Bab, right? That was his sheikh. I understand why many people had different interpretations than Sharia Islamiyah. They're sound, it's good. I don't think that was a problem. But going as far as to declare prophethood, I think that's where the only problem is with the Baha'i. That's it. That's my thinking. Okay. In terms of the other question, where to start with that one? One of the things, and help me with your question, because I remember one part, I might not remember everything, but I'm going to start with the Dr. King part. Is that okay?
I'm asking if there is a connection between Martin Luther King
Yeah.
and Ustadh Mahmoud, since both of them were trying to make reform for Christianity and Islam.
Right. Good. Yeah, Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther or Martin Luther King Jr.? Martin Luther. Oh, okay, I'm glad we clarified that. Right. Okay. Yeah, that's a... Wow. This is out there. This question is out there, and I don't know, it might be beyond my knowledge base. What I think is that Martin Luther was very important because he challenged Catholicism, which was really powerful and really taking people in the wrong direction. And so Protestantism, challenging that and telling people they could interpret for themselves, they could use their own brain, they didn't have to have a clergy telling them, because that whole idea of somebody else pardoning you and you not working to be pardoned yourself is very problematic. And so that was the value of the Protestant movement. And so I think that certainly what we're talking about with Ustadh Mahmoud is something that revolutionary. It's certainly revolutionary what he's doing. But I would say, in a sense, because, and again, it goes back to Tariq Muhammad. I mean, I have a simple mind, and my answers keep repeating themselves, right? But I believe because Tariq Fikr Jamhuriya is the way out of our dilemma. This was the other part of your question. Not just for Muslims. It's the way out for human beings. Bini Adam. Now, it's going to be something that's going to have to happen over time, because some people will be practicing, and some people, Islam, Tariq Muhammad, and they'll be practicing at different levels of perfection, and other people will be having their own worship or no worship at all, and still being moral, right? But I agree with you that the world is in a dilemma. That's obvious just from what just happened with Iran and the man occupying the White House. Yeah. The world is in a dilemma. I believe that Ustadh Mahmoud's illumination of the second message of Islam, built around that understanding of the difference between Meccan and Madinese revelations, and his illumination of Tariq Muhammad are capable of providing a structure for communities and nations and for individuals to harmonize themselves and to live in peace. I do believe that it's capable with it. We have a long way to go, obviously. And so it's hard for me to know exactly Martin Luther and Ustadh Mahmoud, but I really think, there's two things I want to say about that, and then sorry, real quick. We shouldn't be frightened that the Jamhuriyeen are making such tremendous claims about this Sudanese man. We shouldn't. I think we will have a tendency to do so because of the nature of the world in which we live and the histories that we've experienced. But for me, I answer the question, and you didn't ask this question, but it came to my mind. How does an ideology like this come out of Sudan? A man from Sudan? It's not your question, but... And my question is, why should it not? If we really understand a little bit about history. And that's the last thing I will say about Ustadh Mahmoud. He was a very proud black man. This is another thing. He was very proud to be an African. And that was another thing that attracted me to him, right? Is that he said in a conversation one time, he was talking about the British, and he said it like, they're not our teachers. No, they're not our teachers. No, we were cultured. He didn't say this, but this is how I understood it. We were cultured, right? And engaged in intellectual knowledge before they were. They're not our teachers. That's kind of what I heard him say. So I just will end there. I hope it didn't. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much.
طيب الشكر الجزيل لكم جميعا لحضوركم من قريب ومن بعيد الناس الجون من ريشموند. وحقيقة أنا بحيي عبركم الشعب السوداني العملاق، الشعب الذي آمن به الأستاذ محمود وضحى بحياته من أجله. الشكر لكم مرة ثانية، وإن شاء الله نلتقي في مناسبات أكثر وأكثر.